we actually have results that show us that there are times when the test is clearly not working. One that's quite amusing just came out of China in a pre-publication paper. A 68-year-old Chinese man went to the hospital with symptoms that didn't sound that serious, but he tested positive for coronavirus and he went to hospital and he got better and he tested negative twice. So they released him. But then they tested him again and twice he tested positive and he was readmitted. And bizarrely, he was put on antiviral drugs. So he was put on antiviral drugs because they so believed that the test was accurate that even though he had no symptoms, they felt that he was sick. And this is where the modern world is, that sickness has become virtual. If your test is positive, you're sick. It's got nothing to do with your symptoms. Anyway, he survived the antiviral drugs and he tested negative 4 times. So they released him again. A few days later, he tested positive again. He was readmitted to the hospital, put on antiviral drugs again, and then a few days later was tested negative and was released. And I don't know when this happened. It's probably fairly recent, but this guy might go around in this cycle forever. It's kind of funny, but if you were this person who was, what's that song about the subway in Boston, the Kingston Trio, and somebody got on when the fare was a dime and they increased it to 15 cents and he only had a dime so he couldn't get off, and he's still on the subway going around and around because he can't get off. It's a little bit like this. I mean, is this 68-year-old guy going to be spending 2 years effectively in jail, going to hospital, being let out, going back to hospital, because his test results are screwed up? In this paper, it was clear that the scientists had not seriously considered the possibility of a false positive. It was not mentioned. Another paper from China reported on consecutive testing results from 27 people out of about 600 patients. I think it's about 5%. These are people who had rather inexplicable test results. So they defined the test results as either N negative, P positive, or D dubious. They didn't define dubious, but I assume what this is that the cycle count is, say, between 37 and 39, such as one paper that I looked at. And so if they had 36 or less, they were positive. If they had 37, 39, they were dubious, and 40 and over, they were negative. I assume it was something like that, even though they didn't define it. So I will read some of the test results. And remember, these are consecutive results. They probably were several days apart. So we had one person who was dubious, dubious, positive, dubious, dubious. Another person negative, 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 positive, negative. Another person negative, dubious, dubious, positive, negative. There was somebody in there who was negative, positive, negative, positive. Positive, positive, negative, dubious, positive, negative. Negative, positive, negative, positive. Positive, negative, positive, negative. Positive, negative, positive. Several people had that. So I don't want to bore you with these, but there were 27 different people who had bizarre results that do not fit with the they do not allow you to believe that the RT-PCR test is accurate as used for coronavirus, or that the viral theory is correct. So one of the things you could believe is that the RT-PCR test is seriously flawed, and it can produce either a lot of false positives or false negatives. Another thing you could think of is that the RNA is not viral, and so the fact that the RNA comes and goes, that's what RNA does in your human body. If you're under some kind of stress, your body will produce a certain kind of RNA. And then when there's less stress, there'll be less RNA. So you really can't say that RNA coming and going is anything special. Another study, this time with data from Singapore, did RT-PCR tests almost daily on 18 patients. And the majority of people went from positive to negative back to positive at least once, and up to 4 times in one patient. So if we assume, again, that a positive test is infected and a negative test is uninfected, then these people went from infected to uninfected to infected in a hospital environment with all the best infection control procedures in the world. How could this be? Well, the most logical thing to think is, well, the test is not accurate. So maybe the cycle threshold is too high or too low. But we could move the cycle threshold. This was a cycle threshold of 37. We could move it to 40. And maybe some of those people, instead of going positive to negative, would have stayed positive because they would have had a cycle count below 40. But maybe not. Maybe we would have had different people going from positive to negative back to positive. And if we changed it from 37 to, say, 35, we might have the same thing. There's no guarantee that any arbitrary selection of cycle threshold will result in no anomalous test results. But it's so important to the viral theory that people believe the tests, that despite all of this contradictory information, the tests are still treated as if they're absolutely accurate. I listened to the chief health officer of my province of Alberta, a woman named Dina Hinshaw, and I think it's really important to understand that these public health officials are generally not scientists, and they are embedded in a very conservative, hierarchical system where critical thinking is not really encouraged. She said that if you are in contact with a coronavirus case and you test negative, you will be quarantined because you might still be incubating the virus. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the RT-PCR test. She probably learned about antibody tests, and the idea with antibody tests is you get infected with a virus, and some days or weeks later, your body starts to produce a measurable quantity of antibodies, and if you're lucky, it fights off the virus, and you get healthy, and you become immune. So once you have a strong viral antibody response, you will never get sick with that virus again. But that's not how RT-PCR works. According to Buston, the limit on sensitivity of the test is 3 molecules of RNA. And he said that with these high cycle counts, you have reached the limit of detection. So what this means is if there were 3 molecules of matching RNA in the nasal swab, for example, then you would still test positive. So how could you be in an incubation period? If you have so little RNA in your body, supposedly from the virus, that you're not even getting 3 molecules in a nasal swab, then how can it be causing anything? Like, are you infected when there's so little? And I would imagine that in many of these cases, the people stay negative and stay asymptomatic. So basically, if the test is so great, if somebody tests negative, they're uninfected. This is not like an antibody test. Antibody tests have what is known as a window period, which they often choose as several weeks or several months. And they say if you're negative within that window period after having just been infected, that doesn't mean that you're not infected. Although the whole window period thing is kind of questionable, that is the belief with antibody tests. It's not the belief with RT-PCR. But again, it's a bias towards assuming that more people are positive, more people are infected. So they want to push the cycle count, the cycle threshold, to the point where more and more people test positive. They want to interpret negative tests as you might be positive. I've previously mentioned a paper from China where they tested a woman 18 times. She tested negative every time. They really wanted her to be positive, so they just declared that she was infected, despite having tested negative so many times. Another problem with the test is that the results can be quite different depending on whether it's a nose sample or a throat sample or some other part, or stool sample or some other part of your body. So if the virus is throughout your body, how can this be? Now, obviously, if you had something like a fungal infection, it might just be, say, in your mouth. And if your intestines were tested or something like that, you might not find any. But this is a little bit different because viruses are so small, they just flow around your body so easily. So there should be at least small quantities of the virus everywhere. And given that the RT-PCR test is so ultra sensitive, it should be possible to test them. Again, when they test multiple samples, they generally use an algorithm, which is if we test 10 different samples in your body and 1 or 2 of them test positive, we're going to call you infected, despite the fact that the majority tested negative. Another important point, and this gets back to the very existence of the virus, is that there's no way to distinguish a false positive from a true positive or a false negative from a true negative. If we had a bunch of people testing positive and we suspected that some of the tests were not accurate, how would we come up with a way to determine truly whether or not somebody was infected? Well, the only possible gold standard is the purification of the virus. So in the case of, purification of the virus is not easy, so you don't want to do it all the time. RT-PCR test is very fast and quick, and if it works most of the time, that's good. But let's say we've got this 68-year-old man in China, and it's like, okay, well, there's something wrong with the testing here. Let's have a look at it. So when he tests positive the next time, we take some samples and we run through a process that is known to purify the virus if it's there, and we run through the process and we do not find any virus. And so we declare him uninfected, and the attempt to purify the virus is overrides any RT-PCR or antibody testing because it's an absolute test. It is a gold standard. And it's possible with testing like this that you can spike the person's sample with particles that are similar in size to the virus, and that you can verify that those particles are present after purification. Again, if you could purify the virus from this person, then when he tests negative again, you could try to purify the virus again, and you might find that the virus is present, but for some reason the RT-PCR test is producing false negatives. So you could resolve the false positive, false negative thing by purifying the virus. So purification of the virus is not just to see whether the virus actually exists, which I don't believe it does, but if the virus does exist, purification could be a tiebreaker in the case that you have insane test results that obviously cannot all be correct. But at present, there is simply no way to distinguish a true positive from a false positive, and they're not even using common sense. Like if somebody tests positive and they're 100 miles from the closest other coronavirus case, and they haven't traveled in the last 10 years, and they haven't seen anybody who's another coronavirus case, and they haven't seen anybody from Wuhan, China, or anywhere close to Wuhan, China, you might use common sense and say, well, this probably is a false positive. If they had done that, then maybe Italy wouldn't have had an epidemic, because their first person who tested positive in Italy had no travel history or no connection with other coronavirus cases. And within 24 hours, they had about another 30 cases, none of which had any connection with the first case that they found. So I think that the Italians were just finding random false positives. And it looks like an epidemic because you keep testing and you keep finding cases, and it looks like the epidemic's spreading. But if you step back and you think about false positives, you could say, okay, well, maybe with our test procedure, we're getting 1% of, no matter what group we test, we'll get 1% positive. I think understanding more about RT-PCR also allows us to understand better why there are such big differences in the percentage of people who test positive. Now, one of the influences is probably who you decide to test. So if a bunch of people, say in January or February, got off an airplane from Wuhan, and you tested them, they're probably healthier than average. They may have been working over in Wuhan, they may have been tourists, but if they were traveling and working, they were probably relatively healthy. If you test a cruise ship, you have probably a largely reasonably healthy population, but it's skewed towards the elderly, and there will be people who are traveling despite serious health effects. I mean, some people want to go on one last cruise before their life is over. So that's a very different population. If you encourage people to go to the hospital and ask for testing based on the vague symptoms that are considered to be coronavirus, like cough and fever, then you are going to have a population that is uniformly sick. That's the reason they came in. If you encourage people who are just worried to get tested, you're going to have a slightly different population. If you divide the population into those who are stressed out about every new disease that's coming along and those who really don't think about it, there are probably differences between those two populations. So there's going to be a lot of differences depending on which, there's going to be some differences depending on what population you test. Now, if it's viral, you would expect to find a higher level of positives in sick people. But even if it's not viral, it could be that this RNA is produced in response to some respiratory stress, and therefore, if people are sick, you would be more likely to have the RNA. I mean, the fact that there are a lot of asymptomatic people who test positive indicates it's not quite that simple, but it could still produce a bias towards sick people testing positive more often. But I think that looking at the RT-PCR technology, we can see that the testing methodology could make a huge difference in the percentage positive. So for example, in Canada, the percent positive is around 1 to 2%, but in the United States, it's around 10%. That's a pretty big difference. In Korea, it was 3 to 5%. Is this because the cycle threshold is different? Is it because the reverse transcriptase enzymes are different? What are the differences between the systems? Has anybody tried to normalize the systems? By that, I mean the Koreans sending samples to Canada and having them tested in Canada, and the Canadians sending samples to Korea just to see if they're getting the same results. I mean, if the Koreans send samples to Canada which are, say, 3% positive, and the Canadians find 1% positive, then you know that there's a big difference between the testing methodology. If the Americans sent a bunch of samples to Canada of which 10% were positive and the Canadians came up with 1%, then again, you would know that there was a big difference. It appears that a lot of the newer tests are pushing the cycle threshold harder, and that will result in a higher percentage of positives. But I think some differences in the populations who were tested may have some influence, but probably the bigger influence is how the tests are configured. And one of the things that Buston did was he basically took the cover off the machine and showed us just how complicated it is inside. It's easy to fall into the trap that if you just put a sample into the machine, press a button, a bunch of lights flash, a piece of paper comes out, or more likely there's a screen that comes up with a report, and you've got 100 samples in there and it gives you 100 different results, you get lulled into complacency and you think, well, the results must be correct. But in actual fact, you have no way of knowing that they are correct. And if a lab on the other side of town is doing the same thing, if it tested the same samples, it might very well not come up with the same number of positives and negatives. And it's probably not as simple as one lab would produce more positives and negatives. There probably would be samples in one lab that were negative and positive in the other, and vice versa as well. There's a lot of complexity which is generally ignored. I really hope this helps you feel like you understand RT-PCR a little bit better. We took off the hood. We went in pretty deep. By going over it again, hopefully I've helped you get a somewhat better understanding of this. It's a fascinating technology. It's incredibly powerful, but it's not without its flaws. And we do tend to be over-reliant on technology, and if it's shiny and flashy and simple to use, we assume that it's perfect, and that's unwarranted.